Today we are talking to Igor Perisic, Chief Data Officer, as Kareen already mentioned. So Igor, you've had a very interesting and illustrious career so far, starting from a mathematician to a brief stint in product management, and now you're a Chief Data Officer at LinkedIn. Can you briefly walk us through your professional journey and if you had to guide people on how to become the next Chief Data Officer of LinkedIn, what does it take?
Interesting, certainly for me. Illustrious, I'm not too sure. I think I was one of these that didn't necessarily have a great idea upfront what you want to do. So I kind of went through my career doing things that were of interest. As you mentioned, my background is in statistics, not in computer science. And the stuff that I was doing then was trying to find subspaces, or let's say projections, where you would have patterns, and think about, in those days, it was more like PCA or whatnot, but high dimensional cloud, you're trying to find structure, you project into something, and then build up some inferences from it. Machine learning, before it was called that, and before, et cetera. But that was always my interest. And then I stayed a little bit in the academia. It wasn't necessary for me. I needed a bit more of an interaction between people. I was doing collaboration across different parts of the world, but not necessarily in my department. I did love mentoring in academia, and that's something that I still miss, teaching students and mentoring. Then I kind of stumbled through the industry. I started very early on in data mining within a startup. I guess my call to fame at that time is that I said no to join Amazon in '99 when they were building the data mining team. Maybe I should have. Then from that, it was more in knowledge management, and I kind of continued developing. It was more around search. And then I moved to another startup, which was more about search at scale, not in the enterprise space, but let's say the wide web on about health.
Right.
And one thing that I noticed then, like I had a bunch of ideas, I could implement some of them, and but I always had to kind of deal with the product manager to get them out. I said, listen, why don't I do is flip it and try it on the other side so I can make the call. Tried a couple of different places. I was a product manager for Microsoft for 1 year in a lab, and Microsoft had this gap at that time between what was the product,
right,
and what is research, and the lab was supposed to be right in between. And that's kind of in my sweet spot. I like to innovate, but I like to also build something that's concrete, that not just writing papers for the sake of writing papers.
Right.
And the interesting aspect there is that I overlapped slightly with Satya at that time. He just had picked up, at that time it was called Live Search before it was rebranded to Bing, and he had picked it up maybe 3 months before I left. Same thing as Harry Shum, picked up the lab roughly at that time. But I needed more speed. I needed more alacrity in development. I had a couple of places to line up to join afterwards. And a friend of mine told me, no, you've got to give us a chance at LinkedIn. Why don't you interview with us? So I did him kind of a favor. I liked it. My call to fame is they asked me, and my interview question was, how would I solve the search problem, which is tied very intrinsically with the social graph? Do you search through your graph first, or do you search through your let's say, content? How do you do these things? And I think I certainly believe I didn't nail the conversation. I just didn't know. So I said, you could try this, you could try that, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess Jean-Louis
that's a really open-ended interview question, I must say.
It is. And then I ended up for like 4 years to try to solve it. So here you go. Then at LinkedIn, I started on search. So technically, I was hired to fix the search engine.
Right.
My first title was director of search, actually, not director of engineering. But I made sure with Jean-Luc, I said, I'm okay reporting to the CTO office, but I'm not interested into doing kind of researchy things that don't see the light of implementation, or that don't to production.
Right.
And he was perfectly happy with that. And then from the graph, I picked up the social graph very quickly because they were really tight. If you remember in those days, the search API was served as of the social graph. So
Right.
the graph would do a pass through to search.
Yeah.
Then the interesting about Voldemort and things like that, the interesting point was we were young, smaller startup, so you had engineers in a bunch of different places, and there was one in product
Hmm.
that John told me this, and we don't know much about that domain, but you seem to have a degree in it. Why don't you just pick up that domain? And it's the beginning of analytics and data science.
Right.
And through my time at LinkedIn, I kind of always done the things that I like, which is hard engineering distributed systems with a mesh with data systems and building up eventually a practice of AI,
Right.
transforming LinkedIn to be more data informed,
Right.
and everything that needed to be done in those days. That's what I've done. That's my journey, and I had the through ups and downs. Hopefully, a lot of fun.
That's amazing. Yeah,
Thank you.
of course, I think I definitely agree with your point of being part of the product management and taking something just from a purely research point of view to the industry and solving practical problems. I think that's great. I do remember from your statistical background, one of your favorite quotes. If I might misquote it, so apologize, but I do remember this clearly. I think you used to begin your sort of Tuesday meetings with your quote of like, there are lies, there are damned lies, and then there are statistics. That was very interesting coming from a statistician. So
Yeah, it's often abused. You can there's a lot of things that you can do wrongly with statistics and kind of try to steer a conversation in different ways, and it kind of borderline on misinformation if you don't do it right. And if you're not open, honest, and quote unquote constructive about it, then it would lead you into trouble. But then the nice thing about coming back to engineering for me was essentially because it was a startup, the ability to actually do these things that I needed. I didn't need to have somebody, and Jean-Luc gave me the liberty and the freedom to do it.
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So speaking of the building these large scale data systems, can you talk a little bit on the LinkedIn's data systems and what makes it unique?
Boy, first of all, we built it because we had a need. So it wasn't ever really a sense of, oh, this would be a cool thing to do, and then let's figure out what to do with it. We were earlier in the cloud days. Very early, actually, Amazon had reached out to us, AWS, with idea of interest. And we had the conversation with them. And at that time, Amazon did not have the ability to have, they said, private spaces. And we said, well, but we can't have our members' data in a place which is public.
Right.
It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So then we built up our expertise in managing our data centers. So because we were too early for clouds to pick us on. And then later on, we were so good at it in operating it, as you know, that it becomes so hard to migrate into a cloud because it's less efficient, just because of the virtual machines, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
But so it came from a perspective of, hey, there's a need. And at those, through our lives at LinkedIn, our careers at LinkedIn, the nice thing that we did is that we believed in ourselves as engineers to be able to build them. Mm-hmm. So there was no point of, at no point of time was, oh, this is too hard. Maybe we were too naive. Yeah, we can do this. And that's how we went at it. And if you think about your system, Voldemort was because we needed to push a lot of data. And at that time, LinkedIn was born on Oracle,
yeah,
Sunboxes, and Solaris. Come on. So then it was rather costly to dump all that stuff in Oracle. And we looked around what to do. And Jay said, I have this fun project that I've done. We can finish it. And said, yeah, sure, let's do this. And that was Voldemort.
Yeah.
But once you could push stuff, we noticed that with our data stuff, our AIs, if you want, in those days, we didn't call them AIs, and the main one was people you may know.
Right.
We wanted to do a simple thing as impression discounting.
Mm-hmm.
And we noticed that, wait, we don't even have that number right because our pipelines are failing all over the place. So we picked up the challenge of completely revamping the pub subspace, and that's what Kafka was born.
Yeah.
We wanted to have a place where we could manipulate data at scale. So we went very, very early on Hadoop. Our SREs were giving me some pushback, to use the proper term, about why do you want to do this researchy thing? And it's like, wait, we basically bamboozled the budget process at LinkedIn to say, well, I know, Jean-Luc, you have up to $25,000 that you can sign on, so we're going to make it 24,900, so you can sign it. And he was okay with it because he knew there was a value to it, but to ease up the process. And we created from scratch and built up a huge cluster on open source Apache. So we kind of had this thing that, yeah, we know these are happening, we're going to build it. And we took the perspective of building them on really solid open source software and contributing back to the community instead of doing something on our own or forking or this or that.
Right.
At times it led us into a little bit of a trouble, but we worked it out. So then the entire ecosystem got built by demand. And that makes it very interesting, and that makes it very, very unique, I think. Because then everything you evaluate into how well it's performing, not just as a system, but how well it is meeting the demand of those that want to use the system.
Right.
So on one side, you have the AI developers that want to use the system. If it's too hard, then it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. From, I can share some of my perspective here. I joined LinkedIn right out of grad school, and for a systems engineer, this was the place to be. We were in the early days of Kafka, in the early days of Voldemort, which is a key value store. And even some of the stream processing systems, and Pinot wasn't even started yet.
No.
For me, this was amazing when we were building something for a real problem and at scale, which was fascinating for me. But I want to ask you on
just to follow up on what you just said. Like, sorry to interrupt you. It's like we didn't make always the right calls. I mean, some of it panned out greatly, and some of it just failed miserably, and then we tried again. It's not because you tackle a hard problem that you always will succeed. By far not. Otherwise, it's not a hard problem, right?
Right.
But at least if you go halfway there, you would have learned quite a lot and made a dent into, okay, I know I learned from my mistake, and here's how we'll adjust.
Right.
Think about Pinot. Pinot before the internal creation was SenseiDB.
Yeah.
Which was based on search, because we had the ability to do faceted search. Faceted searches really count. Hey, that looks like, and that was a mistake in retrospect. Sorry. But then we pivoted because we learned from the lessons about what makes it work, what doesn't. And roughly at that time, Kishore picked it up for us and said, no, let's do Startree, I guess.
Yeah. So we'll obviously dive more into Pinot in a little bit. But I want to ask you about the focus on open source. LinkedIn is one of the very few companies who really, really believes in open source, and not just using, but as you said, contributing back. And of course, there's an inherent risk in this mentality. Can you walk us through, what was going on in your head at the time to take such a big risk of building open source?
I never viewed it as a risk. You have to remember that the search engine that I picked up was, I think it was Lucene 1.3, right? So then we were on open source already.
Right.
I think the mistake that we did earlier on is that we had developed some components to make Lucene work better for real-time and faceted. And we open sourced them as, let's say, adjacent modules, if you want, instead of contributing back into Lucene to make Lucene become that quicker into those space. And then over time, Lucene build them those internally and natively. But we have our things outside of it, and now refactoring is a pain in the neck.
Yeah.
But also the perspective of over time, I think what I've learned is it makes better engineers. Like let's face it, like when you're coding internally and you're doing things within your own company, you're taking shortcuts. We always say, it's really critical to have documentation. Comments in the code are really clear. Your API should be perfect. Your variable should be well named. And wait, you sit next to me. If you need something, just ask me. I'm not going to write documentation, right? So it happens. It's just natural. I was reminded of this actually very early on when we opened up our India office. So I'm traveling to India. I'm listening to the engineering team and say, "What's your main big pain points?" Say, "Listen, we have a hard time to kind of understand." And I said, "Yeah, just call that person." And then it dawned on me, wait a minute, that's 12 hours difference. You can't. And that's going back to documentation and clean code. Open source pushes you to that, because if your project wants to get traction, you better write it well. Then on top of it, it has a name on top, so you have an incentive to do it right.
Yes.
Otherwise, you'll get a lot of negative points on GitHub. So a match made in heaven. But then also the other end is tough. Is like when it gets really a great project that moves along and has a life on its own. I use the allegory. It's kind of like your kid. Your kid has grown up. Now they're adults. They live a life on their own. They're going to leave the family. They're going to leave the house. They're still part of your family. Right. So you got to give them that freedom. So how do you manage that internally? Like, as you know, Pinot, we have a big footprint on Pinot at LinkedIn.
Right.
Same thing with Kafka. So then as it leaves and Kafka does its own thing, well, you have your own stuff that you need to take care of. Right. And I think we navigated that much better than at least Facebook in the older days, which would fork very quickly because the demand is so high, and then upgrading to the next version is tough.
Right.
If you remember, the Kafka 08 release was backward incompatible, and you're like, oh crap. So now it was a nightmare to upgrade, but then we learn our lessons and we don't do those anymore.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, thanks for that. So let's dive into the real-time data system, which is really the focus of our chat here. So how has, even before we get into how has real-time data transformed LinkedIn? Like what were the motivating use cases with why these real-time systems were even built in LinkedIn?
I go back to the origin, as I mentioned, like the first thing that the first AI product on LinkedIn was People You May Know.
Right.
And People You May Know had Jonathan Goldman was the one that created it. But then we couldn't refresh it. It took like months to recompute, and from time to time. But the interesting thing is we would compute, I think it was 10 recommendations, but on the side you would see only 3. So the first thing what I did is, just every time you look at the page, put a random 3 out of 10. So at least there's diversity. It changes. When we shipped that, I got a bunch of tickets from the test teams. Hey, our tests are failing. I said, yeah, but don't worry. It's by design. Don't worry. But then the idea was, as I mentioned, like, as you're getting more, let's do impression discounting. So you see couples. So it's more than just better than random. But then when you start doing this, it starts being real time. You're moving towards getting this information very quickly. And as the site grows, you have more and more. So I think everybody at the beginning, especially for things that we would do internally, is going to build a StatServer account server in any place. Right. So that's the first one, I think. And then the second one is, through time, we started to build, let's say, dashboards. You played with the Excelenti and Lex.
Right.
Which would decompose then a metric and give you some trends and over different set of segments. Well, but that's again the same thing, right? It's what Pinot ended up by being for us at LinkedIn, then, because you can do it at scale and you can do it internally as well.
Right.
Match made in heaven. You're not going to build 3 systems for 2 use cases, right? So at least you have one that works for both. Great. But it gets you from being able to make decisions very quickly to understand what is happening. And that's why we move more and more towards real time. Everybody knows that, I think intuitively, that if you can make slight adjustments in the, let's say, AI recommendations, according to what is happening, your product is going to perform better. Right. You got to be careful not to overdo it.
Right.
Like, if I make instantaneous adjustments completely for People You May Know, that just doesn't make sense. Because these are individuals that you know, and they're not going to change every 2 minutes.
Right.
If my algorithm is doing well, they're going to change over a certain period of time as your network changes, but not instantaneously.
Right.
On the other hand, if you look at an ad system, Well, there, yes, you better adjust very, very quickly because every ad participant has a budget. So you want to make sure that you're not exhausting one compared to the other, that you're balancing the marketplace. And that's real time. It's not batch.
Right.
If you're only going into batch, then you're going to, I mean, it's going to work, but not as efficiently by far. Right.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah. So diving more into Pinot itself, we just heard from you about people you may know use case, which is one of the marquee user-facing analytical use cases for Pinot, which is great for those who may not be aware. It's directly powered from Pinot, and it's one of those things where you're using something a typical use case which was not meant to be user facing, but you're using it in a really high QPS low latency manner.
Right. Right.
What are the other sort of internal use cases of where Pinot is leveraged for LinkedIn's internal analytical use cases? Can you
I mean,
touch upon that?
certainly. You remember that actually, I think the first thing that we did with StatServer, which was pre-Pinot,
Right.
is who viewed my profile. Because who viewed my profile already has certain set of segments that you could actually look at. So
Right.
you would have already these projections, and then you can. But it's certainly the scale as the throughput in queries per second was much lower,
Right.
a bit more complicated than than people you know. Because in the end, people you know, you could pre-materialize them.
Right.
In the older days, we would just refresh them on a 24 hours, and that was fine.
Right.
Today, we're not doing that because we want to make sure that if you accepted an invitation, then now I can slice and dice that teeny cube that I had for you.
Right.
To make
Right.
it the next one much more relevant.
Yeah.
But on the internal side, like as I mentioned, like Excelenti is our A/B testing platform. It has all of our metrics, and this like, I don't know today, maybe it used to be 4,000 when I stopped counting. Maybe I don't know 6,000. So if you click on any one, then you want to know, and you want to dice by different dimensions.
Right.
You have this cube, which is Pinot. It does it, and it does it at scale. It does it at speed. Perfect. You don't need to build something different.
Right.
Other ones are, actually also on the side, like when an advertiser wants to know or would like to know how their, and I can lead you to some extension to Pinot that we're working on, wants to know how their campaign are working. Are they working well or are they not working well? The same thing as you might say, like when you're writing an article on LinkedIn or a post or you're a creator, you want to know what is the interaction with that post.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, but what is that? That is a bunch of counts that you aggregate by different sets of dimensions and say, wait a minute, but that sounds like a Pinot problem. There it is. It is. So you just dump it in it and it works. It's all of these things that get to work, and people understand very easy the analytics use cases.
Right.
They don't necessarily see the internal ones that you use that map exactly the same thing.
Right.
I'm saying nowadays much more than in the past. Sorry.
Sure.
A great engineer. What is engineering all about? Engineering is really about abstractions. You find the patterns and the abstractions, and you basically apply them to your view of the world.
Right.
And and everybody has a toolkit of things that they understand really, really, really well.
And talking
J
about
is the log, so
Go ahead.
you build from it, right?
Yeah.
You know what keyshores are.
Right.
You build on it, and then you have things that you can manipulate and create experiences on top of it, and that's okay. In this one for Pinot, I think what we ended up by having is a great engine that can very, very, very quickly and in real time, which is what the nice addition to it. Like, because in the older days, you would create your cube offline,
Right.
and now you have a cube that's static, and you can manipulate. Okay, fine. But what we've done, or what Kishore has done at that time, and what we've done on LinkedIn is, well, no, you can do that, but you can also then pipe it in Kafka events real time, and your cube would be updating in real time as well. So you do kind of re-indexing on the fly, or you augment so you can serve both use cases.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the biggest benefit.
Yeah. I mean, I can totally relate to this because Um, After LinkedIn, I was in Uber for some time, and we saw similar things within Uber as well, where people were doing a lot of complicated steps uh, to essentially serve a queue, and there are lots of pre-computation involved. And then the cubes would be difficult to change the cubes. Adding new metrics would be very difficult, and then having Pinot there essentially replicated the success that LinkedIn found, and that was fascinating for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more on the UMP pipeline? I think that's actually pretty. That's an amazing thing that LinkedIn has done. So, for our audience, do you want to introduce what UMP is? And
Yes, essentially UMP is our, let's say, managed pipelines, if you want.
right,
And we're expanding that to be a pipeline as a service. So we're always learning on the things that don't work, and we want to make them better.
right,
But in essence, it's like you can hear that in a little bit in the data mesh approach today. Like very often, data scientists or data scientists at LinkedIn, but or AI folks, they don't necessarily have the expertise to run low level code for building up their pipelines.
right,
But they have a very good incentive to want them to be robust, right? Because otherwise, the metrics are all over the place.
yeah,
And traditionally, they would do that through a data, let's call it the big data engineering team. You throw a ticket, I need this metric, and somebody would actually implement it to you. And now you have a source of truth for this metric. And what did they do? They looked at, okay, how did you define this thing? What is the data coming from? How do I need to transform it, aggregate, tabulate, whatever, and pull
yeah,
it there? And what we've done with UMP is they try to remove as much as possible the big data engineer, so you can actually do it. And then it means that there's some things that, let's say, at the bottom of it, there's some stores upon which you can construct. And the
right,
bottom stores, sure, you would actually make sure that they operated well and maintained well. But then after that, it's just the platform. Is it running or is it not running? And when that happened, then you have kind of a consistency,
right,
because all of these tend to be eventually consistent, right? Eventually,
yeah,
in this case, actually, it's a pun on the word, but eventually consistent because, well, you're not going to re-implement them 3 times. And eventually, yes, because, in the end, if it's real time, it's streamed. So sooner or later, it's going to be consistent, not immediately. But especially if you have multiple data centers, right?
yeah,
But then you put a Pinot on it and you can manipulate.
right,
You have consistency, you have a clarity, you have uniqueness of definition. Then we kind of build up Data Hub as a place to say, listen, so now you have a way to look at it as a catalog if you want, but it
right.
shows you where it's from, it gives you a bunch of stuff, and you put Pinot on top of it, and it works.
That's amazing. So UMB is essentially putting data engineers out of a job.
You know what? What I would tell you, it is and it isn't.
Okay.
It is putting you out of this manual job that don't make sense. And by the way, most of the companies are actually outsourcing this manual job.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's another nightmare. I did GDPR for LinkedIn, and like now you look at this thing that you've outsourced 3 years ago. Nobody really knows what it is and what it isn't. Nobody understands what that code is doing because it's done. And nobody's looking at the quality of that code.
Right.
So you have kind of a huge legacy pile of dump that you need to actually do stuff with it. So you don't want to be in that space if you're a big data engineer. You want to be in a space where you build these systems, where you build these pipelines, where you build that infrastructure. You don't want to be this thing that you do over and over again. I forgot who said it. I think maybe it was Kevin. Like the best engineers are the lazy. No, it's David Henke. The best engineers are the lazy ones, because you do it once, you do it twice, and after that, I'm going to actually automate this thing, because you're not going to do it again, right?
It reminds me of sort of how Tesla is sort of doing its manufacturing right now. Earlier you had people assembling the different parts of a car and putting it together, and now the engineers are actually building robots that are now assembling the cars.
And in our case, like then you get back to solving the hard problems. You get back into how do you build these as pipeline as a service, and you operate them. Then you have 3 nines, 4 nines, how many nines you want to shoot for,
right?
Because that is hard. The rest is like a metric a dozen, right?
Right. Yeah. So UMB is really fascinating because it really opened up put the power of Pinot in the hands of essentially anyone. You don't need to be an engineer to
Correct.
build this, and just put your data in and query Pinot in a fast way, and you get your metrics out, which is amazing. I do have a quick question there. What was the time taken to onboard a metric before UMP, and what does it do?
I will plead the fifth. An inordinate amount of time, but an inordinate amount of time from two reasons. I mean, implementation may be quote unquote fast,
Right.
but then you have a queue of them,
Yeah.
and you have a bottleneck on resources. Maybe I don't have 1,000 people to do your metric every instant that you need from. I have maybe 10.
Right.
You come with 100 demands. Well, 10 threads. That's it.
That's
Every
it.
single one is going to take you some time. And then the last one that comes in, it's usually first in, first out. There's no necessity of priority queue around it.
Right.
Takes time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I understand. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for all those insights on Pinot. Any last thoughts on Pinot before we move on to the future of real time analytics?
We can move on to the
Okay.
future if you want. But no, I mean, in the end, as you know, through your experience at LinkedIn, but then at Uber, in the end, it is a piece of software that is actually solving a problem that is rather real, and it's doing it very well.
Right.
Now, as I said, one of the good things from open source is, if you remember, I would ask, okay, what is out there in the open source ecosystem already?
Right.
And then, of course, individual will give you a matrix, and their stuff fills all the rows,
Right.
all the columns.
Right.
Their column would fit all the rows, and the other rest doesn't. But then you need to be careful to say, okay, wait a minute, is this thing that you're adding to just make it complete on your end actually does make sense? Is it worth it or not?
Mm.
And in this situation, I think you'd be hard pressed to think about, oh, let's build a new one.
Right.
Why? What
Right.
is it that is missing? And then my perspective would have been, well, if you think that it's missing, it's an open source project. Contribute back to it.
Contribute back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense. Awesome. Yeah. So now I want to sort of pick your brain on what do you think, where are we heading to next? Because as of now, things are actually pretty good. We are getting, I wouldn't say, things are broken today, but, what are the things what's on your wish list? If technology is not a problem, if time is not a problem, what would the future look like for you?
So
In real time analytics.
yeah, what I would tell you, I mean, I've been talking to a lot of individuals. The big one in our space is privacy.
Hmm.
So, like for example, a couple of examples that I showed, like who's looking at my post.
Right.
Well, there's some privacy constraints on the side of who is viewing it. And then what you want to do is things like differential privacy that you can pull in. Now, what you want ideally is, well, you want to natively put that into Pinot, so you don't have to re-implement on top of it.
Right.
Because the use cases are going to be slightly different in different areas. So then make it native within Pinot. So now you say, do you want it with privacy or don't?
Right.
And there's different ways that you can do that. You can do that on write or you can do that on read. That's one. And I think the other one, which is getting more and more interest for us at LinkedIn, is around AI. There are a lot of AI features that you want to compute on the fly real time. They're not pre-computed earlier on, and they may have been projections of a cube.
Right.
What is of interest, like right at this moment on the platform? Well, again, that's a Pinot query. So Pinot becomes a feature store in itself of a certain type of features.
Right.
You're not going to put neural net embeddings into Pinot, hopefully, just like that. But otherwise, yeah. And these are two spaces that I think are growing.
Yeah, makes sense. Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for that. Before we almost at the end. Before we conclude, I do want to ask you. We've been through a grueling pandemic. Things have been bad, but also people have been learning a lot of new things while sitting at home. So what I want to ask you, what is one thing that you learned in this pandemic, sitting at home with?
How much I care about my family.
Nice.
As you know, some of my family is in Europe, and I used to travel quite often. And even though they felt far away, they felt like it was always reachable.
Right.
And with the pandemic, that's not the case.
Yeah.
Then I see it in all people at LinkedIn. As you know, there's a nasty surge in India. There's been one in Brazil as well, and it just takes a toll on all of us.
Right.
Just how connected we are.
Right. Yeah. That's amazing. All right. Thank you so much, Igor, for joining us. This was really insightful. And no, hopefully we should do this one, one more time. Would love talking to you again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much.